Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as we wait for the room to fill in. So just hang tight, introduce yourselves in the chat if you like, and we will get started in about a minute or two. And I'll keep repeating this message every couple of minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. Introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. We're just waiting for the room to fill in for any late arrivals. We'll get started shortly. And like I said, I'll keep repeating this message a couple of times as new folks are entering the room. And we'll get started in 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. We're just waiting for the room to fill in. Introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. Grab a cup of water. We'll get started in a couple of minutes. And I'll probably repeat it one more time and then we'll get started. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. I hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Herman Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. And in my role, I get to engage with folks through events, volunteer opportunities, and I get to speak with you all here and hopefully, answer some of your questions and clear up any confusions you may have. Feel free to drop in questions into the Q&A box as we go through the presentation, but we won't answer those until the end. And I do want to say that the webinar is recorded and the presentation slides will be sent out to you via email following the presentation, as well as the recording of the presentation. So don't worry if you miss anything, it's recorded, we'll send it out. So a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about why TechEquity exists as an organization. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address some of our most pressing economic issues. But before we get into all that, we're going to talk about why we're here. Well, TechEquity started because some of its founders and early members saw the symptoms of growing inequity within their own neighborhoods. And they understood that there was this perception that tech and tech workers were the main cause of that problem. So they were noticing things such as rising rents, increases in displacement, increases in traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others, they realized that they weren't alone in their concerns and that they as tech workers were uniquely positioned to help contribute to some solutions. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis we're living in gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on low-income people and communities of color. Many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. And at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed. So as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate inequality in a region that some of our early founders were already noticing. So because of this affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've been able to see both sides of the coin. I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for them, what that means for their job security, for their homes, and for their families. But I also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and have found lots of success. However, we see that when tech shoulders the blame, it starts to create this us versus them dynamic that's further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help, and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within the region. And while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal that's caused by the pandemic, it's important to note that many within the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. More than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to better support our neighbors, but it can be hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our housing crisis in the Bay Area. The fact that rents are rising really isn't a surprise to anyone on this call because we know this, we feel this, we've heard this friends and family renting. So while some Californians are very successful in tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants actually decreased slightly. So we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as an organization, and it's where tech is headquartered. But a version of the story is playing out across the country. And it really is a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address this shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. So before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around the 4% mark, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims spiked to 16%, which is a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So in the span of a month, we lost a decade's worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. So at TechEquity, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it won't happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we have to show up, and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. At TechEquity, we believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to issues where we live in will result in more ethical decisions at work and more engagement in our communities. And we know we can do this. And the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar today and just getting to understand a little bit more about our affordability crisis. Our goal at TechEquity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. We help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you about the most critical civic issues where you live, and we do this in a variety of ways. We host book club discussions, we produce webinars, we have voter guides. We also advocate for public policy that's rebalancing power and builds economic equity. And a good example of this is the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which we worked with alongside coalition partners, legislators, and relevant stakeholders to help pass protections for 8 million California renters, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And finally, there's corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of change in the broader community through our corporate partnerships and engagements with companies. As we talked about, tech workers have outsized political power that's largely untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers and to outside perspectives builds more empathy and ethical practices in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At TechEquity, our two key issue areas are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of this, these issues really intertwine and intersect in a variety of ways because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. So while the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about inequity within our own neighborhoods. This affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices that we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain our communities feeling now, especially during the pandemic, as we just talked about. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color in the Bay Area, in California, and all across the country. And that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave ratings to guide investment to neighborhoods. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. As we can see with the image of the screen, it's a map of San Francisco. So all those little red blocks you're seeing around your screen, those are examples of redline neighborhoods. And those communities that were deemed risky for investment didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color. And that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. In other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy, and it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or for maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. So the crisis we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech, and it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends across California and all across the country. So on the screen right now, these are two examples of red line neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, which are two up and coming tech hubs, tech cities in the United States. And once again, all the red blocks around the map are examples of red line neighborhoods. On the left side of the screen is Austin, Texas, and on the right side of the screen is Atlanta. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from accessing this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in red line neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now, you may be asking yourselves, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be something like a huge rent increase, you suddenly lose your job, your car breaks down, and you have a huge bill to pay. And this impacts almost 1 out of 3 Californians. So 33.9% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates, with 41.2% of African American households living in liquid asset poverty and 56.2% of Latino households living in liquid asset poverty. Now, there really isn't a single reason as to why this is happening. Many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can still take a role in supporting better policies moving forward to help address some of these issues. So the twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcome of the pandemic. And like we talked about, many people in our communities were already struggling. And as the pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. So As we can see, the hourly pay for workers has not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So, according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers that's covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019, meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. And this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for better pay rates in alignment with the work that they're delivering. And while all workers have lost out because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. While there's a gap between worker pay and productivity, like we just talked about, there's also a pay gap between race. White men are earning more cents to the dollar. That's that orange bar on the left side of your screen. In comparison to Black men and women, those are the two blue bars on the right side of your screen. And because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in the cities that are providing good jobs. And the cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. If you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average two-bedroom working a regular, normal 8-hour day. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that two-bedroom. Again, if you're making minimum wage, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that two-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up this impossible situation for low-wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work. And this problem persists across the country. It's not unique to the Bay Area. So even though costs in upcoming tech cities, like we talked about in Austin, Denver, and Atlanta, aren't as high as San Francisco or parts of the Bay Area, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone that's earning minimum wage in that region. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. However, not every salaried employee is making six figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away from this image of the wealthy tech worker are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers, who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have that good salary to afford your apartment. But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? Well, rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build to keep up with demand and population growth. And these are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and that stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. As you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making those good salaries we just talked about. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. Those are the two red bars on the left side of your screen. And as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and supportive services. And some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember, when someone tells you that we just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. And because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities at higher rates while people with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, those are those orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco as they're being pushed into homelessness or worse. So that's actually why that last blue bar is actually increasing, because there just isn't enough affordable housing available to support the most vulnerable members of our community. And amongst people of color, the rates of displacement are just as more tragic. So we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at higher rates. Furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. So a combination of discriminatory housing laws, low wages, a lack of affordable housing production have created a crisis of displacement, and displacement is driven by policy choices. So we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. As we talked about, the folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and low wage jobs are the ones getting hit the hardest by this crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. And the good news is that members at TechEquity are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. And together we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. And we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity within our tech economy. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of years and years of bad policy choices. The good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. At TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities a better place to live. So we've identified structural changes that need to happen in order to achieve this vision, but it's clear that we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production. So building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build. Preservation, making sure we are providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing. Protection, we need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the necessary housing that we need, but in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants from being displaced. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social systems. It's embedded in us all, and especially in housing. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we need to be thinking about short-term and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors are more at risk than ever as a result of the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. So we want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within, that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits regardless of the role that they're in. So we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse workers, and contracted workers. So in partnership with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, and making sure that the workplace is safe and ensuring that there is fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. So training as a standalone approach will not lead us out of any inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. So in order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment and training and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, and not just to create broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are more likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. And we'll strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, there are tons of ways for you to get involved with Tech Equity. We host tons of educational and social events. Just next week, we have an event on caste bias in tech, and I'll be talking about that shortly. If you're interested in public policy, you can support our 2022 priority legislation bill, SB 1162, which I'll also be talking about it. If you're a contract worker in the tech industry and you like to share your story, you can help us out by sharing your story for our contract worker disparity project, or you can just reach out to me and I can point you in the right direction. We can go over what your interests are, what project you want to work on, or what area of interest, and then we can work something out. If you're interested in corporate practice, we offer a wide range of services to companies and provide ways for them to get involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So same thing, you can reply to the follow-up email and I can connect you with our corporate partnerships manager. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, but while building community in the process. For Tech Equity this year, our key initiatives begin with the Contract Worker Disparity Project. Really is a first of its kind worker-centered initiative that sheds lights on the practice of contracting out, proposes and advocates for public policy solutions, and partners with companies to adapt responsible contracting practices. We also have the Tech Bias and Housing Initiative, which examines the promises and perils of housing technology. So we aim to ensure that technological innovations in the housing space do not reinforce the racist housing systems and policies of the past. We're passing economic justice policies. So every year, Tech Equity introduces a bold policy agenda to address economic inequality in the housing market and in the workplace. So our priorities this year are around housing data transparency, equitable labor standards, affordable housing, data surveillance protections, and more. And finally, we have the System Reset Initiative, which is helping tech companies create on-ramps for people returning from incarceration. So we're partnering with justice-involved people and organizations to get system reset into every tech company in California. So what can you do today? Well, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, tell them that you came to this presentation to check out the organization. You can sign up for a community conversation and meet with me one-on-one. Like I said, this is just an opportunity for you to talk more about how do you like to participate with the organization, and have me answer any questions you may have on a Zoom call, one-on-one, face-to-face. And then finally, you can take action with us by becoming a volunteer for any of the projects that I said. And we also offer civic tech projects. So if you have a technical background and you'd like to use those tech skills for any of the projects that we have currently, you can also become a civic tech volunteer. So now I'll talk about that piece of priority legislation. So it's the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act. So that's SB 1162, and SB stands for Senate bill. So SB 1162 would make pay equity reports public so that all workers have the information that they need to ensure that there is equal pay for equal work, and ensures that companies create a fair and equal playing field for all workers by posting salaries in the job description and posting promotional opportunities to their existing employees before selecting a candidate. So SB 1162 successfully passed the Senate floor a couple weeks ago, and it's moving on now to the Assembly, and it's about to hit the Assembly floor in a couple of weeks, maybe next month in August. So there are ways to support this bill. So just keep an eye out, like I said, for more info on the bill. We've had in the past volunteers call into committee hearings to voice statements of support, sign online petitions, and we can keep you posted on future opportunities for this. Next event we have educational event is next week on Thursday, July 21st from 12 to 1 p.m. Also as a webinar, it's called Caste Bias in Tech. So we'll be discussing caste discrimination in tech and how the caste system intersects with racism, sexism, classism in the US, and how existing hierarchies in tech are reinforcing these caste dynamics. So we'll get to hear from two speakers. It's a panel discussion, and they'll share resources on what we can do to address this issue. So as I mentioned, there's three things you can do right after you get off this call. Tell a friend about our work, sign up for a one-on-one with me, and I can point you in the right direction, or you can take action by becoming a volunteer. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information to absorb. I'm gonna now take a quick pause and see if anyone has any questions. Like I said, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording for the presentation. We'll send out the presentation slides, a link to sign up for a one-on-one, and other relevant links to some of the information that we talked about today. So I'll just take a minute, see if anyone has any questions. It can be a quick question, and like I said too, reply to the follow-up email if something comes up later, or sign up for a one-on-me if you want to get more in detail over Zoom. Cool. So I'm not seeing anything. Totally fine. I want to thank you all for your time. We hope you feel inspired to join a growing movement. I hope to see you at a future event or as a future volunteer. Stay connected with the organization. And yeah, we'll send out that follow-up email. Keep an eye out for it in the next hour or two, and I'll give you some of your time back. Cool. Thank you, everyone.